Hello and welcome everybody to Brave New Conversations. I'm very, very pleased to be here today with good friend, extraordinary writer, gifted investigative reporter, Amy Goodman. Thank you for joining us, Amy.
It's great to be with you, Robert, and congratulations on this amazing, this just wonderful project that you're involved with, Brave New Films and Conversations.
Thank you. So it's nice to be in the other chair interviewing Amy versus being interviewed by, although Amy and Democracy Now! Have been, amazing friends and supporters and helping fight the good fight together, which I can't stress strongly enough. There are folks on our side who work in media who don't have the ability to communicate the way you do at Democracy Now! Every time Democracy Now! Covers one of the campaigns we're involved in, Afghanistan or Sick for Profit, immediately we can see the difference in screenings or house parties or people going online. So my hat's off to you for that. So I wanted to talk a little bit, before I talk about the wonderful book, which I cannot recommend highly enough, I wanted to talk a little bit about personally some stuff. So was there a moment in your life when you said, this is what I have to do? Or was it an accumulation over time? Or was it good genes? What led you to where you are now? Genes as in genetic, not in dungarees.
I think I always did journalism one way or the other. When I was younger, it was the junior high school and high school newspaper. It was just a way to hold those in power accountable. In high school, it was the principal. And then, just moving on to a bigger stage. But seeing as a path to try to ensure that things were more just. You expose what isn't, and then hopefully something comes out that's better. And I did that through college, whether it was newspapers or newsletters. And then very quickly, when I was graduating from school, my college thesis, they accused me of being too journalistic, which I thought was very interesting. And I thought, well, that shouldn't, lower my grade. But the idea, that was interesting itself, doing the college thesis. I did it on a drug called Depo-Provera. I was in anthropology, medical anthropology. It's a drug you inject in the arm, a contraceptive, every 3 months. And it made women sick. And it was injected into 10,000 black women in Grady Hospital, in a charity hospital in Atlanta. It was injected in women all over the world, but not approved in the United States. So Upjohn, that was the pharmaceutical company at the time, it has since been merged, submerged, whatever, sent it out to scores of countries. And I didn't have the money in college to go investigate in Thailand and other places where they wouldn't investigate. They'd shoot a woman up and she'd go up into the hills or mountains. You'd never know what happened to her. What was amazing is that it was injected into women here before it was approved, and they didn't know that it was experimental. They just saw it in the pamphlet of contraceptives as the shot. And they started getting sick, and it led to Billy Avery making the Black Women's Health Project to gather women to start to deal with their own health care. So, but the thesis that I did on women in science and experimentation, and particularly looking at Depo-Provera, when I was going to defend it, it was a group of 3 professors. Actually, Laura Nader was my advisor. She had come east. She was a professor at UC Berkeley, but I was allowed to choose a professor from outside because I didn't like the way anthropology was taught in my school, and I didn't feel that they could deal with this. She helped me. She advised me, but for some reason, I can't remember why, she wasn't there at the defense. So there were 3 men, and they looked at me. They had the thesis, and one was, it was at the time of, smoking and blowing smoke in your students' faces. Miss Goodman, you recognize this is not a thesis in anthropology. And he pushed it across the table. He said, you might try sociology. The problem was, this is not the beginning of my freshman year. It's the end, and I am planning to graduate in 2 weeks. And so I had to get out of there. And he said, I said, oh, but I am getting my degree in anthropology. And he said, do you know what anthropology is? And I figured if I am going to graduate, I better agree with him. So I said, what is your definition of anthropology? He said, well, your problem is you looked at people here in this country. An anthropologist looks at a person in another culture and it looks at another culture. You are a participant observer, but you looked at your own culture. And so he took a drag of his pipe, and I said, actually, doctor, I agree with you. It's having the distance by looking at someone else's culture. And I'm looking at the practice of science in America today, and that is white, male, corporate enterprise. And I consider myself outside of that, so I am looking at your culture. Took a drag of his pipe and said, "Carry on." So I finished my thesis, graduated, came back, turned it into a series of articles with another colleague for the Multinational Monitor, one of Ralph Nader's publications, begun by Ralph Nader and Alan Nairn in Washington, D.C. And I turned on the radio when in New York, and I heard this remarkable station, WBAI. It was all the grittiness, the honesty, the authenticity, nothing to sell, just putting it out there in its myriad accents of New York. This was the reality, and I thought, oh my gosh, I would like to go there. I would like to see what this, I'd never thought about radio before. And I was going to take some graduate courses in biochemistry. I saw a radio documentary course being offered down the hall. This was in New York. I went, met the teacher. He was a producer at WBAI, amazingly enough, Andrew Phillips, and he walked me over to WBAI that night, and I never left for many, many years, and I'm still a part of the Pacifica world. It is so important to find that at the beginning of the career, what people find at the end, and that is independence.
Yeah, wonderful. And did you know early on, because one could be a journalist and be lousy at radio. I mean, you happen to have that incredible voice, and I don't know if it's just because I've listened to it for so long, but it's, you know, no matter how upsetting what you're talking about is, there's something in your voice that encourages me at least to want to know more and go further. Some of that is innate. Was some of that learned? I mean, there are people who could have no ability with radio who have good politics even, right?
I don't think it's physically about someone's voice. I think it's about caring about the subject matter. And I think it's about all journalism. It's just being fair and accurate. It's, you know, providing a forum for people to speak for themselves, talking about things that you have seen, providing a forum for debate, no matter what the person's position, that they should feel when they leave that they got to express their point of view. You may not agree with it, but that they accurately and fairly got to say what they wanted to say. Even if it's an all-out, drag-out fight, that you hear all the sides. I didn't say both sides, because sometimes I think there are many sides to an issue.
And when I was doing your show, whatever, a few months ago, I guess, and your mother had just gotten quite sick, and you were talking on the air and before about her and her influence on you, so, and whether she was listening to the show even then. So you want to talk a little bit about that? Or?
Yeah, in fact, that morning, Robert, I came to the show from the hospital. My mom was a remarkable woman. She died October 5th. She got sick at the end of August. She was probably sick before, but none of us, including her, knew. She was hiking in New Hampshire in August, had a pain in her right side, went to the doctor. He thought nothing of it, but I knew if my mother complained, it must be very serious, and I called the doctor and said, you have to take this seriously. They did a CAT scan, found 4th stage metastasized cancer, and we brought her to the hospital, and Mount Sinai in New York, and it was, to say the least, a roller coaster, a catastrophic 5 weeks of going from my mother being a woman who didn't even have her own doctor because she'd been so healthy, to making our way through a completely sick, broken healthcare system. Basically, my 3 brothers and I were sentries posted at the door, basically holding out our rifles with a sign that said, do no harm. And we couldn't protect her. At first we weren't sleeping there at night, but then we found even to be away for a few hours, something catastrophic could happen. And it has to do with having teams that see the person as one entity, and they are a part of that organism working with her. Just one little example, and I'm sure many different people will identify. you know, she's told she can only have clears. That's clear liquid, broth, apple juice, perhaps tea. And the swallow specialist comes in with yogurt and crackers. Now, we looked in shock. My mother hadn't had food in weeks. She said, to her, it looked like, you know, the richest ice cream. Oh, what flavor is that? I said, Ma, not so fast. Excuse me, she can only have clears. No, 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 it's not about that. She said, we're just testing the swallowing. I said, I know, but once she swallows it, I learned this in like elementary school, I think, that it goes somewhere. She's not allowed to have that. No, 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 it's not about that. It's the mechanism of the swallow that we're testing. Don't think about anything else. I said, I know, but she may have to think about something else. We called in the doctor. He said, you know, you're not the doctor, as we were trying to control her care. And so they had her eat this yogurt, and she got incredibly sick, incredibly sick. And the surgeon came in later that day, and he said to me, what about clear, don't you understand? But it's that idea of you don't see the body as an organic system. I watched President Obama give his health care address to the joint sessions of Congress from the cafeteria there. When my mother came out of one surgery, she never seemed to go unconscious. She is laying there, everyone else unconscious around her, and we're all around her, as is the doctor, and she's saying, 3,000, 3,000. What, Mom, 3,000? 3,000, the doctor leans forward. 3,000, Mrs. Goodman? Yes, the Chinese learned how to manage pain 3,000 years ago. Why haven't you figured it out yet? And then the turnaround came a few weeks into our stay. And I saw in New York Times one of those advertorials on the op-ed page where a corporation advertises, like Mobil. And this was a doctor writing, named Dr. Diane Meyer, that the two things patients most want is time with their doctor and pain management that they don't get. And I was sitting there, I said, Mom, we have to go to this hospital. I look at the end, Dr. Diane Meyer, Mount Sinai. We were there. Well, we ultimately got in touch with Dr. Meyer, and she is one of the leaders in the palliative care movement in this country. And she really helped us navigate this, unknown frontier for us, and that was the dying and death of my mother. To be with her, to be able to express our devotion to her, that's what those last few weeks were about, and the whole 5 weeks. You know, she had protected us our whole lives, but ultimately we couldn't protect her, but we could show her how much we loved her. She had been there for us. And Dr. Meyer said there are 5 things, as my brothers tried to figure out how to bring their children, you know, 9, 10, 11, 12, could we bring them into this? Their beloved grandmother. And what about friends, her dear friends? And she had a number of important suggestions. One was, have them write letters, the friends, not just, you know, light letters, but about what she meant to them over time, about their experiences with her. We read these letters to my mother. She'd say, oh, read that again. Oh my God, I remember that. But then the children, the grandchildren coming. One of her grandchildren, Anna, who's going to be going to medical school, she's a wonderful singer, and she sang her At Last. And Eli, her grandson, who's 10, composed a symphony on the computer for her. Ariel and Jasper, 17 and 10, just talked to her about what she meant to them, and she asked them about their day and then said, I'm always, always there with you. And it was transcendent. And Dr. Meyer told us there are 5 things you want to say. Thank you, forgive me, I forgive you, I love you, and goodbye. And it was a guide, a way to be with my mom until she died on October 5th. And to be with her, to share the music, she was in every intensive care unit. And in one of them, the documentary, Amy, the documentary. I gave her the Daniel Ellsberg documentary. She sat, they're coming to stick her with pins, to needles, to test her, you know, the endless. No, for a minute. And for 2 hours, she sat with it on the medical tray in my computer, and she watched it. When it's done, I will let you take whatever blood you need, but right now, I'm going to watch. And then she held forth. She was an adventurer, world traveler, intense curiosity like my dad, who I lost 10 years before. Loved people, intensely interested in other cultures, loved literature. My mom taught women's history and literature at local community colleges. To cops, to firefighters, to civil servants who, if they got a few more credits, would have a higher salary. So they'd come in, oh, this is Chicklet, this will be easy, this is the easiest class, and I'll get a higher salary. She'd introduce them to Toni Morrison and Virginia Woolf. This was in the 70s, and the firefighter would bring his daughter, the cop would bring his wife. Oh, this is what she's talking about. This is why my daughter's so restless. The classes would swell by the end. I mean, whole families would be coming. And then my mom went back to school and went to go into social work. And then just a final story. She met my father at a Hebrew-speaking camp. And Noam Chomsky went there also. My father and Noam Chomsky were bunkmates. And one year, they weren't allowed to speak English. One year, my mom was voted funniest camper. And the next year, she was voted most serious camper. So anyway, through her life, she went to Iran, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. She went to Turkey. She went to Israel. She went to Palestine recently. And she went with a tour group. And when the Palestinian tour guide wanted to take them through a checkpoint, of course, they couldn't pass. But my mother, with her classical Hebrew, I think it's sort of equivalent to Shakespearean English, when she saw the soldiers say no to him, she went up, you know, these could be her grandchildren, and she said, what seems to be the problem? A kind of, I don't know how she said it, but you must part the ways, or something like that. These soldiers parted, and the tour group went through. And the Palestinian guide put his arm around her and said, I'm sticking with you. And that has been my philosophy all my life, is I'm sticking with her.
Oh, that's wonderful. So clearly we know your upbringing had something to do with the terrific work you do today. One of the things that I've always been curious about, and didn't have a chance to ask you till I got you in this chair, is one of the issues that we struggle with at Brave New Films, and you struggle with it even more, is how do you make the decisions about what to cover? I mean, there are so many stories, there are so many important issues, resources are always a challenge. Do you have some sort of systematized process? Is it your gut? Is it your staff, or some combination therein?
I mean, I work with a brain trust of producers, absolutely wonderful, and every day they are, we're just working together, combing the world through internet, through speaking to people, through emails, through newspapers, through direct experiences, reporting, finding out what's happening in the world, events, news that's breaking, and then trying to dig deep and get to the heart of the story. And so often the heart is a person or a family who's directly affected by a policy and who can speak from that wisdom, that experience, instead of what we get in the rest of the media, which is the, you know, punditocracy, the small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. And that's why I think Democracy Now! Is news with a heart, because it's people, real life, or people who've lost others, talking about what's happened in the world. War is real, it's personal, it's someone's home blown up, it's their mother lost, it's global warming, you know, the Maldives, the lowest lying island in the world, and the president goes underwater to have a cabinet meeting to show, right, scuba dives underwater to show this is what will happen, this is our warning to the world. But it's the real life people who are affected by policies who are also doing something about it. And that's where the hope is, I think. We deal with such difficult issues. You don't want people to be so depressed that they're paralyzed to do anything. But the people who are analyzing the issues are the people who are doing something about it. And that's where the hope lies.
And do you find in dealing with the analysis, because again, that's so interesting. It's so similar when we work on the videos, which is you don't, I mean, the easiest thing in the world is to make a video or tell a story and have people go out and slit their wrists or throw themselves under a bus because it's so depressing. But that wouldn't exactly be fulfilling our political mission. So one of the things we're always balancing is how do you tell these stories truthfully and yet give people some encouragement to take action. So is that a conscious part of the process at the station when you're trying to determine how to tell a story or who to interview or which stories to take on?
Well, I think I think people are compassionate generally, and when they hear about a difficult situation, if they can figure out a way to do something about it, they do. I mean, you can have people who are activists who are involved with groups and then you find out how to hook in. You can directly help someone you hear about. You can get involved at an analytic level because you're hearing someone describe a situation. You decide this policy has to change. I think there's so many entree points because people are actively engaged. Once we did a story, it was on the death penalty and doctors' involvement in it in prisons. The Physicians for Human Rights in Boston had put out some report. They had been on 60 Minutes before, so we weren't getting them first. And then we got them. We might have even learned about it on 60 Minutes. And we asked if they would come on. And you know, for them, this was years ago, and 60 Minutes was bigger than Democracy Now! But the response they said they got after they were on Democracy Now! Versus being on 60 Minutes. I mean, people calling for their reports, having them FedEx places, cars coming to pick them up. It's about a mobilized population, not immobilized, but a mobilized population. People do care. You know, I think people are horrified by torture. People are horrified by war, by global warming, by lack of health care for themselves or for others. I think that's not the fringe minority or the silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media.
And do you also, in terms of that, because I think one of the silences or the reason for the silences is whether, I don't know that it's conscious or not, this notion that things are either too complicated, which you get from the media and a lot of those experts lacking in any expertise, and also the notion of connecting the dots. So even on the progressive looking at problems, it's often the single issue idea. Again, something I'm curious about because we struggle with it a lot here. How far is our role in connecting those dots so people can understand the context of a particular issue around healthcare or around war or around global warming?
I mean, all of these issues go together. First of all, I just want to say on issues in general, the way they're dealt with in the media, you know, the 8-second soundbite. And if you can't say it in 8 seconds, you're not ready for prime time. Huge problem. Because that just reinforces the status quo. You can't say too much in 8 seconds. You can repeat the standard wisdom, like Saddam Hussein is like Hitler. Oh my God, 4 seconds, 3 seconds, I'm more than ready for prime time. And everyone knows you don't need to say one more word. We all understand what you mean. But if you have something else to say, like say, the leaders of this country might be guilty of war crimes, actually that's in less than 8 seconds, so I'd be ready. But I sound a little crazy. What are war crimes? What are the Geneva Conventions? You got to explain the Nuremberg principles, and you don't have time. But actually on healthcare, I just want to make this point that I think you could do it in less than 8 seconds. The administration, the media has made it extremely complicated, like ExxonMobil did with global warming, right? You pour millions and millions just to obfuscate the issue, to make it so complex that people just say, I think there's a debate there, when there actually isn't. On the issue of health care, it is, if you want to talk about single payer, the idea that everyone should be covered. I mean, you could count it. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. This is seconds, right? 3, 4, 5. What could you say in 8 seconds that would convey anything? You can say, oh, the solution for health care, why don't you take the age of Medicare eligibility and just lower it to when you're born? It's like 3 seconds. Everyone understands what that is. We do have to improve Medicare, but it's a basic way of dealing with everyone. And then, you know, if you have more money, maybe you can get some boutique care. But everyone would understand that, but how rarely that's said. And in terms of connecting things, healthcare, you look at the healthcare, for example, of veterans. So this combines war. and healthcare. And Harvard Medical School did a study. So, and I just need I always like to get the facts and figures right. Just one sentence. On Veterans Day, we interviewed Dr. Steffi Wohlhandler, and this new study saying that 4 times as many U.S. Army veterans died last year because they lacked health insurance than the total number of U.S. soldiers who were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan in the same period, right? Harvard Medical School said more than 2,200 veterans under the age of 65 died in 2008 because they were uninsured. Now that brings together war and caring for our veterans and soldiers. When you look at what happened at Fort Hood, the terrible mass killing, 13 civilians and soldiers killed, more than 30 wounded, we have to really look at the depth of despair caused by this intractable, unending wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. At Fort Hood alone, 10 soldiers a year are taking their lives. And that's probably an underestimate, or 10 personnel at Fort Hood, many more within the military overall. And so we brought on a few weeks ago a couple, Janet and Greg Kiesling from Indianapolis, whose son committed suicide in Iraq on his second tour of duty. His wife had left him in the first tour of duty. His life was falling apart. He went on a suicide watch. They took his ammunition away for a week. He came home and he said, that's it. He needed to get help. He was from the VA. And they tried to give him a bonus of tens of thousands of dollars to return. He said, no, I've got to get myself together. And he moves into the Army Reserve. He's called right up. He's sent back to Iraq, and he kills himself. His parents are still waiting for a letter of condolence from President Obama. But he doesn't write letters of condolence to those in the service who take their own, to those families whose loved ones took their own lives. But he served, Chance Kiesling, for 6 years, and by all accounts, he was a stellar soldier. And his family feels he gave his life for his country. He served his country, and they didn't want him to go back to Iraq, but he had to. You know, there is a draft for some, and they feel that their sacrifice should be acknowledged. I think you can make all these connections from healthcare to war. Yes, it's not too hard, actually, to connect the dots.
Well, I just applaud you for doing that. I find even, again, in many of the issues and good organizations and folks fighting the progressive fight, it's too often sort of a me versus you. In other words, my issue is more important than your issue, rather than what you're doing, which is connecting it up so you understand the system.
Because people's lives are complex. We are all connected. It's very hard. It's like, you know, with my mom, it's not that your heart isn't connected to your liver, connected to your lungs, connected. It's all, we are all in one cosmos and one body, and everything is connected. And then to look at all the parts that make the whole system go.
Well, sort of related to that, in reading the book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, great title. You know, I was riveted by so many of the different pieces. Is there a favorite of yours, either a piece you wrote or a radio show or an issue that stands out over the passage of time, or stands out now because of the death of your mother, or something that immediately comes to mind when you think about one that you got a lot of satisfaction or achievement from?
I would not say one particular story. I also want to thank Dennis Moynihan, who edited this whole book and has been with me on every column the week. It's based on my weekly columns for the last 3 years, which are called Breaking the Sound Barrier. But just where we started, I think, is a metaphor for what we have to do as journalists. You know, we start at the UN Security Council just outside, this tapestry reproduction of Pablo Picasso's Guernica, the town in Spain that was bombed under Franco. And it has become a famous symbol against the war, because you see the pain in the faces of the animals and the humans. And it hangs outside the UN Security Council. And when the US officials, the UN officials, were pushing for war in Iraq, I think they recognized the irony of that being the backdrop of their news conferences. And so they shrouded it with a curtain. And it is our job to pull that curtain back. From President Bush to President Obama, they have forbidden photos from getting out of torture, for example. The issue isn't the photos, the issue isn't these horrific images of war. It's the reality of what they represent that has to be changed. We've got to stop the cover-up, we've got to pull the curtains back, and then we all can decide what we want to be behind those curtains. It can be a much more beautiful, just world, but we have to know what we're dealing with first, and that's our job as journalists, to go to where the silence is.
Well, it inspires me just sitting here, and I want to encourage everyone to help pull the curtains back. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. To scores of countries, and I didn't have the money in college to go investigate in Thailand and other places where they wouldn't investigate. They'd shoot a woman up and she'd go up into the hills or mountains. You'd never know what happened to her. What was amazing is that it was injected into women here before it was approved, and they didn't know that it was experimental. They just saw it in the pamphlet of contraceptives as the shot. And they started getting sick, and it led to Billy Avery making the Black Women's Health Project to gather women to start to deal with their own health care. So, but the thesis that I did on women in science and experimentation, and particularly looking at Depo-Provera, when I was going to defend it, it was a group of 3 professors. Actually, Laura Nader was my advisor. She had come east. She was a professor at UC Berkeley, but I was allowed to choose a professor from outside because I didn't like the way anthropology was taught in my school, and I didn't feel that they could deal with this. She helped me. She advised me, but for some reason, I can't remember, I have to try to ensure that things were more just. You expose what isn't, and then hopefully something comes out that's better. And I did that through college, whether it was newspapers or newsletters. And then very quickly, when I was graduating from school, well, my college thesis, they accused me of being too journalistic, which I thought was very interesting. And I thought, well, that shouldn't, like lower my grade. But the idea, well, that was interesting itself, doing the college thesis. I did it on a drug called Depo-Provera. I was in anthropology, medical anthropology. It's a drug you inject in the arm, a contraceptive, every 3 months. And it made women sick. And it was injected into 10,000 Black women in Grady Hospital, in a charity hospital in Atlanta. It was injected in women all over the world, but not approved in the United States. So Upjohn, that was the pharmaceutical company at the time, it has since been merged, submerged, whatever. Sent it out.
Covers one of the campaigns we're involved in, Afghanistan or Sick for Profit. Immediately we can see the difference in screenings or house parties or people going online. So my hat's off to you for that. So I wanted to talk a little bit, before I talk about the wonderful book, which I cannot recommend highly enough, I wanted to talk a little bit about personally some stuff. So was there a moment in your life when you said, this is what I have to do? Or was it an accumulation over time? Or was it good genes? What led you to where you are now? Genes as in genetic, not in dungarees.
I think I always did journalism one way or the other. When I was younger, it was the junior high school and high school newspaper. It was just a way to hold those in power accountable. In high school, it was the principal. And then, just moving on to a bigger stage. But seeing as a path, why she wasn't there at the defense. So there were 3 men, and they looked at me. They had the thesis, and one was, it was at the time of, smoking and blowing smoke in your students' faces. Miss Goodman, you recognize this is not a thesis in anthropology, and he pushed it across the table. He said, you might try sociology. The problem was, this is not the beginning of my freshman year, it's the end, and I am planning to graduate in 2 weeks, and so I had to get out of there. And he said, I said, oh, but I am getting my degree in anthropology. And he said, do you know what anthropology is? And I figured, if I am going to graduate, I better agree with him. So I said, what is your definition of anthropology? He said, Well, your problem is you looked at people here in this country. An anthropologist looks at a person in another culture and looks at another culture. You are a participant observer, but you looked at your own culture. And so he took a drag of his pipe, and I said, actually, doctor, I agree with you. It's having the distance.
Hello and welcome everybody to Brave New Conversations. I'm very, very pleased to be here today with good friend, extraordinary writer, gifted investigative reporter, Amy Goodman. Thank you for joining us, Amy.
It's great to be with you, Robert, and congratulations on this amazing, this just wonderful project that you're involved with, Brave New Films and Conversations.
Thank you. So it's nice to be in the other chair interviewing Amy versus being interviewed by, although Amy and Democracy Now! Have been, amazing friends and supporters and helping fight the good fight together, which I can't stress strongly enough. There are folks on our side who work in media who don't have the ability to communicate the way you do at Democracy Now! Every time Democracy Now!